Welcome to the deep dive. This is where we take source materials, filings, articles, transcripts, and really unpack them for you.
We dig into the details to find the key insights.
Exactly. And today our mission is to look closely at a recent FDA warning letter. It was issued to Neurosync about their device, the IIE-SESYNC. That's iSync.
Right, it's an assessment aid for traumatic brain injury.
And we're going to focus specifically on the quality system problems the FDA highlighted, things like risk analysis, design controls, and really explore what it all means if you're working in quality, regulatory, or risk in medtech.
And we've got some solid source material for this. We looked at the FDA's de novo summaries for both the iSync and its predicate, the iBoX.
Okay.
We also reviewed a podcast transcript that discussed the tech and how it's used, and of course, the main event, the warning letter itself, dated May 9th, 2025.
Great. So let's start with the basics. What exactly is this iSync device? What's it supposed to do?
Okay, so based on the docs, it's a prescription device. It uses eye tracking tech, usually a VR headset, sometimes a tablet.
Eye tracking. So it watches where your eyes move.
Precisely. It measures eye movements. The idea is that certain brain issues, like from a concussion, can subtly mess with how accurately your eyes track a moving target.
Ah.
So the device measures things like how smooth your pursuit is, compares it to norms or a target stimulus, and then generates some kind of output.
Like a score.
Yeah, scores, maybe a classification like positive or negative for visual tracking impairment. The 510K mentions visual synchronization metrics.
And it's for concussion diagnosis.
Well, here's a really critical point from the sources. It's specifically cleared as an aid in diagnosis.
An 80, not the whole diagnostic test.
Correct. It's meant to be used with a standard neurological assessment by a trained professional. And the specific indication is pretty narrow, within 3 days of a sport-related head injury, and only for patients aged 17 to 24.
That seems really important, the aid part. It's not making the call on its own.
Absolutely vital, and that flows directly into how we think about the risks.
Makes sense. What did the FDA identify as the main risks?
Both the de novo for the older iBox and the 510K for this iSync point to the same primary risk to health. Incorrect or misinterpreted results, including false negative, no brain injury when in fact brain injury is present.
A false negative. So the device says you're okay, but you actually have a concussion? That sounds potentially bad.
It is. The iBox de novo actually mentioned a false negative rate around 20% in its data. Now, the iSync 510K showed better performance, citing a 98% negative predictive value in its specific study.
Which is much better.
But the risk is still there. If a clinician gets a false negative and maybe trusts the device a bit too much, perhaps not fully internalizing that aid-only limitation.
Then someone with a real concussion might go back to playing sports or just regular activity too soon.
Exactly. The iBox summary specifically mentioned potential for further harm, persistent symptoms, even cumulative injury risk or long-term damage. That's the consequence hanging out there if the result is wrong and relied upon inappropriately.
Wow, okay. So given that risk, how is it supposed to be controlled? What are the mitigations?
The usual suspects, really. Good clinical performance data showing accuracy.
Right.
Solid software validation and verification, hazard analysis, and crucially, labeling, making it crystal clear it's not standalone, it's for trained users, providing the performance specs like sensitivity, specificity.
Got it. So you've got this device using complex eye data, software interpretation, giving a result to help diagnose something serious, where a wrong answer, especially that false negative, carries significant risk. Feels like the quality system needs to be absolutely watertight.
You'd think so. Which brings us to that warning letter, issued May 9th, after an inspection earlier in 2025.
And the verdict was?
Adulteration, basically, failure to comply with quality system regulation, 21 CFR 820, and misbranding as well.
It wasn't just one small thing they found, was it? The letter seemed to cover a lot of ground.
Oh, yeah. Multiple QS areas, violations cited in design controls, KPA corrective and preventive actions, purchasing controls, and acceptance activity.
That's quite a list.
And on top of that, the misbranding violations, failure to report certain corrections and removals to the FDA, and failure to apply unique device identifiers, UDIs.
Okay, so they found problems across the board. How did the company respond? Did the FDA think their fixes were adequate?
No, not really. The letter is pretty blunt, stating the company's response was not adequate for several observations.
Why not?
The FDA cited things like not providing enough detail on their planned fixes, only looking at recent documents instead of reviewing records relevant to the current device design, and just generally lacking evidence that corrective actions were actually done and, effective.
So it sounds like maybe they didn't convince the FDA they truly fixed the underlying systemic issues.
That's the impression,
Yeah.
yes. It suggests the response might have been more superficial.
Okay, let's really dig into one of these findings that seems central, especially given the device's function and risk. The one under design controls, 820.3, about design validation, but linked specifically to failures in risk management.
Yes, this is observation 1DI in the letter, and it's quite revealing. It points out that the company's own procedure for risk management, SOP 10011.
Their own rule book.
Exactly. It stated that they determined risk levels using risk priority numbers, RPNs, and it even described using defined scales for severity and occurrence right there in the procedure.
Okay, so the procedure was clear. Use RPNs, use these defined scales to figure out risk levels, standard stuff for risk management.
Pretty standard, yes. But here's the kicker. The FDA found that in a key risk document, the software risk analysis, RA 10110.
So the software that drives the whole thing.
Right. In that analysis, the company did not use RPNs.
Wait, what? Their procedure said use RPNs, but they just didn't for the software risk analysis.
That's what the letter says. And it gets worse. The scales they did use for impact and probability in that software risk analysis, they weren't adequately defined back in that main risk management procedure, SOP 10011.
Hold on. So the procedure says use method A with scales X and Y, but for the software, arguably the most complex part, they used method B with scales Z and Q, and scales Z and Q weren't even properly defined in the master procedure.
You've got it. It's a fundamental disconnect. They didn't follow their own documented process for evaluating risk during design, specifically for the software component.
Okay, this feels like it goes way beyond just a documentation slip-up. Let's really explore this. Why does this specific failure, ignoring your own RPN method, using undefined scales for software risk? Why does that matter so much for a device like iSync? How does that procedural gap increase real-world patient risk?
Think about it. The device's entire value proposition hinges on accurately measuring eye movements and then using software algorithms to interpret that data reliably. Those clinical performance numbers we talked about, NPV, sensitivity, they depend on that accuracy and reliability.
Right. Garbage in, garbage out, basically.
Or maybe even, subtle if flawed data leading to a misleading result. Now, if your core process for analyzing the risks associated with that software is broken, if you aren't using your defined method like RPNs with clear scales,
then you can't really trust your own assessment of how bad a potential failure could be or how likely it is to happen.
Precisely. You lose the objective, systematic way to evaluate and prioritize risks. How severe is this failure mode? How often might it occur? What's the overall risk level? If you're not following your defined process, your answers to those questions become unreliable, subjective, maybe, not systematically derived.
Okay, so you can't reliably assess the risk. How does that broken risk assessment then connect to some of the other problems the FDA found? Like violation 1.ai, a design requirement for tracking performance wasn't met, but they approved the test report anyway.
That's a perfect illustration. If your risk analysis didn't properly flag the criticality of meeting that tracking performance requirement, maybe because the severity or likelihood was underestimated due to the flawed RPN scale approach, then you might mentally downgrade the importance of that failure.
So you might think, it's close enough, even though it doesn't meet the spec.
Potentially. But a device with subpar tracking accuracy is fundamentally more likely to produce inaccurate scores. That directly increases the risk of a false negative, or maybe a false positive. The risk analysis should drive how strictly you enforce those requirements.
Okay, makes sense. What about 1.a.ii? Failing to verify that the software properly handles bad data, like warning the user or suppressing a score if the input is garbage.
Same logic applies. If the risk analysis didn't adequately capture the risk of providing a score based on poor quality eye tracking data again, maybe the severity was downplayed because the process was flawed, then the rigor applied to verifying those software safety mechanisms might be insufficient.
So you might not test those warnings or score suppressions thoroughly enough.
Exactly. And the user could end up getting a score that looks legitimate, but was derived from completely unreliable data without any warning, again, leading to a potentially incorrect clinical interpretation.
It really sounds like this risk analysis failure isn't just one isolated finding. It's like a crack in the foundation that weakens everything built on top of it.
I think that's a good way to put it. It undermines confidence in the design mitigations. Look at 1BI. They made a design change to stop the device collecting data after the headset was removed, but they didn't verify the fix worked properly.
Right.
A robust change control process must be linked to risk analysis. Did the change introduce new risks? Did it effectively mitigate the original risk? If your underlying risk process is shaky, your change control might miss things. Maybe the fix didn't fully work, or maybe it caused a new problem, leading to erroneous results, risks that weren't properly evaluated.
So failures in V&V change control. They can potentially stem from that initial weakness in risk assessment.
They absolutely can, and it doesn't stop at design controls. Think about purchasing controls, violation 3. They failed to evaluate suppliers according to their procedure.
Okay.
If your risk analysis didn't properly consider the impact of component quality, like the eye tracker sensor or its embedded software, which the FDA mentioned, then you might not prioritize supplier evaluation correctly. You could unknowingly integrate a component that doesn't perform reliably, directly impacting the device's core function, because the risk wasn't adequately assessed and controlled through supplier management.
And then skipping final checks, like visual inspection under acceptance activities, violation 4.
Same deal. If risk analysis identified potential physical defects that could impact function, but the acceptance activities designed to catch those aren't performed, then those risky devices could reach the user.
Even the misbranding seems connected. Failing to report corrections, like that Pico 2 component issue causing freezing.
Right. The FDA called that a health risk. Not reporting it means there's no transparency, no systematic tracking and addressing of a known risk factor across the installed base.
Yeah.
And the UDI failure just makes traceability harder.
So pulling it all together, because that fundamental risk analysis process was flawed, they didn't follow their own rules for RPNs and defined scales, the company essentially lost its reliable compass for navigating risk.
Exactly. They couldn't demonstrate through their own system that all the potential risks, software bugs, hardware failures, usability issues, supplier problems were systematically identified, evaluated consistently, and effectively controlled.
Which ultimately casts serious doubt on whether the device can reliably and safely function as that aid in concussion assessment.
Precisely. If the risk analysis is broken, the confidence that mitigations are truly adequate is eroded. This directly increases the chance of those incorrect results, like the false negative, impacting real patients.
Okay, this is a powerful example. What are the key takeaways here? The absolute must-remember lessons for quality, regulatory, and risk folks listening.
Lesson 1. Maybe the most obvious, but clearly necessary. Follow your own procedures. Seriously, documenting them isn't enough. You have to do what they say. Risk management, supplier evils, KTA, acceptance neurosync got cited for not following multiple procedures.
Don't write checks your system can't cache, basically.
Right. Second, define your terms clearly, especially in risk management. Your scales for severity, occurrence, probability, impact. They need clear, objective definitions in the procedure. If you say you use RPNs, use them as defined. Ambiguity here is dangerous, as this case shows with the undefined scales and ignored RPNs.
Risk management can't be a separate checkbox exercise.
Absolutely not. Third, integrate risk deeply into design controls. Risk analysis has to inform requirements, guide V&V testing, and critically evaluate every design change. It's foundational, not adjacent. Ensure your process confirms that risks are controlled in the final design.
And don't let problems linger indefinitely.
That's 4. Execute CAPEAs, improve effectiveness. Open CAPEAs need closure. Root causes need addressing. And you must verify the fix worked. Leaving a CAPEA open for years, especially on something core like score accuracy, that's a huge red flag for regulators and indicates a system breakdown.
Your suppliers are effectively part of your system, too.
Yes. Number 5. Supplier management is critical. Your device is only as good as its weakest component. Evaluate and monitor suppliers according to your procedures. Ignoring this, like with the sensor software supplier here, introduces unmanaged risk.
Don't skip the final check.
Number 6. Acceptance activities matter. Ensure finished devices meet all specs before they go out the door. Perform the required inspections and tests. Those final checks are your last chance to catch issues.
And finally, play by the reporting rules.
Definitely. Number 7. Comply with reporting requirements. Understand and follow the rules for things like reporting corrections and removals, Part 806, and UDI Parts 88030. These aren't just bureaucratic hoops. They're vital for traceability and public health. The FDA takes them very seriously.
Okay, those are critical lessons for practitioners. Now, let's shift gears slightly. If you're a senior executive listening to this, what's the message? This isn't just a QA problem, is it?
Not at all. When you see systemic failures across design control, KPA, purchasing, acceptance, and especially a fundamental breakdown in risk analysis, that points higher up. It suggests potential issues with resources, oversight, or maybe even the fundamental culture around quality.
So, what should executives be doing if they find their company facing this kind of warning letter or wanting to prevent one?
First, commission a truly systemic QMS review. Don't just patch the specific holes the FDA pointed out. Do a deep, top-down assessment of the entire system. Look for the root causes of why multiple processes failed. As the FDA noted, looking only at recent docs isn't enough.
Make sure the system isn't just shelfware.
Exactly. Ensure procedures are actually followed and effective. It's not enough that they exist. Are they understood? Are they consistently implemented? And critically, do they work? Do they actually ensure risks are controlled, changes are managed, suppliers are vetted?
And put your money where your mouth is regarding quality.
Invest properly in QA, RA, and risk. These aren't overhead to be minimized. They are essential functions for building safe products, ensuring compliance, and protecting the business. Give them the resources, training, and authority they need.
Foster the right mindset throughout the company.
Champion a culture of quality. Leadership has to set the tone. Quality and compliance can't be seen as obstacles, but as core values embedded in every decision. Everyone needs to feel ownership.
And understand the real stakes.
Yes, grasp the real-world impact. Executives need to connect the dots between a warning letter finding, like a faulty risk analysis, and the potential for device malfunction, patient harm, recalls, lawsuits, and reputational damage. It's not just about regulatory compliance. It's about patient safety and business viability.
So this deep dive into the iSync warning letter really underscores a key point. Failures in basic quality system elements, particularly something as fundamental as risk analysis and design control, aren't just technicalities.
No, they have direct, tangible consequences for how safe and effective a device is out in the real world. They impact whether a clinician gets reliable information, like for that concussion assessment.
Which brings us to our final thought for you, the listener. Given how absolutely critical robust risk management is for medical devices, how truly confident are you that your own company's risk process, from the procedure on paper to the day-to-day reality, would hold up under intense scrutiny?
And more importantly, what are the potential real-world consequences for patients if it doesn't?
Something to think about. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.